The mountains wore their dusk like a crown of shadows, the ridges slipping into purple as though the night itself was pulling a shawl across its shoulders. A hush carried through the pines, broken only by the dull thud of an axe striking wood. Jedediah Holt stood in the clearing before his cabin, shoulders rolling with the rhythm of labor. His beard was coarse, peppered with gray though he was not yet old, and a scar ran jagged from the corner of his jaw to the hollow beneath his ear. The mark had become part of his face, as inseparable as the sadness he carried in his eyes. When the log split beneath his axe, Jed leaned on the handle, breathing deep of the mountain air that smelled of resin and wood smoke. He looked toward the ridgeline where the last gold light clung like embers. "They don't want me down there," he murmured to no one but the shadows. "And I don't belong up here." His words sank into the silence like stones into deep water. Far below, in the little town that squatted between hills and river, a stagecoach rattled in, its wheels throwing up the dust of August. Clara Beaumont stepped down with the grace of someone who had been taught to walk beneath chandeliers and velvet curtains, though her boots were already dust-stained from the journey. She kept her chin high, though the set of her mouth betrayed a fatigue deeper than travel. She'd come west carrying whispers, an engagement broken, a fiancé who had abandoned her for another, and a humiliation that clung even as she tried to outrun it. The townsfolk gathered, eyes quick to measure. Martha Calloway, broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, leaned to another woman and hissed words meant to carry. "She won't last the winter." Too soft in her skin, too proud in her step. Others nodded, as if cruelty were easier than kindness. Clara felt the eyes upon her, the judgment heavy as a yoke. She squared her shoulders and walked through the street. Dust clung to her hem. A man called out to fetch her trunk, but even his courtesy held the curl of amusement. Sheriff Amos Rourke, standing by the post with his broad hat and weathered coat, gave her a long, measured look. "These mountains don't forgive weakness, Miss Beaumont," he said, not unkindly. "Be sure you know what you're looking for." She gave him the faintest smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. In the days that followed, Clara tried to lose herself in work, in small errands through the town. Yet gossip followed like smoke, and each whispered word found its way beneath her skin. She overheard women mutter about her city airs. Men laughed that she'd break if the wind blew hard enough. Still, she did not lower her gaze. Humiliation had already stripped her once. She would not let these strangers take what little dignity remained. When she asked about traveling deeper into the mountains, perhaps to find solitude away from their tongues, the townsfolk grew restless. No one wished to guide her. "Too dangerous," they said. "Bandits, bears, storms. You'll be dead within a week." She persisted, her tone polite, but her eyes unyielding. It was in the mercantile, under the lamplight that smelled of kerosene and dust, that she first saw him. Jed Holt stood near the counter, his frame filling the room, his presence as solid as oak. He carried with him the smell of pine sap and leather. A hush spread through the room. Mothers drew children closer. Men stepped aside, as though his scar alone marked him as untamed. Jed's eyes swept the shelves without urgency, but Clara felt his solitude as though it were a cloak draped heavy around him. She stepped toward him, her heart pounding with a strange mix of fear and defiance. "Sir," she said, her voice steady though her fingers trembled against the folds of her skirt. "I need someone to guide me into the mountains. Will you help me?" The room seemed to lean forward in silence. Jed turned his face toward her slowly, his scar catching the lamplight. His gaze lingered a moment too long, and something unreadable flickered in the depths. Then his voice, gravel deep and deliberate. "Best you keep it town, ma'am. Ain't no safety where I live." His refusal was not cruel, yet it struck like a door closing. Still, Clara did not look away. In that pause, the air between them thickened with something neither had words for, a recognition, or perhaps the faintest spark of kinship. The days turned restless. Clara's resolve hardened against the town's whispers. One morning, clouds were massing dark along the horizon, but she saddled a horse and set her jaw toward the ridges. The trail climbed quickly, dust giving way to pine needles damp with the scent of oncoming rain. The higher she went, the colder the air grew, and the mountains seemed to watch her with indifferent eyes. The storm broke sudden and fierce. Rain sheeted down, turning earth to mud, thunder growling like a beast in the peaks. Her horse reared, frightened, nearly throwing her. She clutched the reins, but water blinded her eyes, plastering her dress to her skin. Each step was harder, her boots sinking deep. Her breath came sharp, her strength failing. At last, she stumbled near a ridgeline, the world a blur of gray rain and black stone. She sank to her knees, shivering, her hands raw from grasping at slick branches. The storm swallowed her cries. Through the haze, a shadow emerged, broad-shouldered, steady, moving toward her as though he had been there all along. Jed's arms scooped her up with a strength that felt both terrifying and safe. She let her head fall against his chest, too weak to protest. When she woke, it was to the crackle of fire. She lay wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, steam rising from her soaked clothes laid neatly by the hearth. Jed sat nearby, the firelight cutting deep hollows in his face, his eyes fixed on the flames as though they might betray him. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low, threaded with something darker than anger. "I'm a man who does well with company. You stay here, you're at risk, for me as much as from the storm." Clara pulled the blanket tighter around her, her teeth still chattering, yet her gaze never faltered. "I don't believe that," she whispered, her voice soft but firm. For the first time, he turned fully to look at her. The firelight shimmered between them, the silence stretching taut, charged with something dangerous and alive. The storm had softened to a drizzle by morning, mist threading through the pines like pale ghosts. Inside the cabin, the fire had dwindled to embers. Clara sat wrapped in Jed's blanket, her hair unbound, eyes tracing the rough-hewn beams above her. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and pine smoke, with the quiet weight of a night survived. Jed moved about the small room, his steps careful as though he feared to disturb the fragile silence. He set a tin cup of broth before her, his scarred hand retreating quickly once the gesture was done. Clara lifted it, the steam warming her face, and sipped. She could taste not just salt and bone, but the clumsy offering of a man unaccustomed to feeding anyone but himself. Her gaze wandered across the cabin's walls, shelves lined with tools, a Bible worn at the corners, a small wooden horse whittled smooth by restless hands. There was no malice in the space, only the blunt truth of a solitary life. She looked back at him and said, her voice quiet, "You built this with your own hands." Jed paused, then nodded once. He busied himself with mending a chair, though his eyes kept straying toward her. "Town says I ain't right," he muttered. "Too wild, too dangerous. Easier to believe that than to see a man who just don't fit." Clara studied him for a long breath, the fire painting his face in restless light. "Or maybe too honest," she said softly. Her words seemed to stop him in his tracks. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Only the rain dripped steadily outside. When dawn stretched gold across the ridges, Clara stepped out into the chill, refusing his offer to ride her back down. "I'm not ready to return," she told him. "Down there I'm smothered by whispers. Up here I can breathe." He didn't answer, but he let her stay. They moved through the morning together, fetching water from the creek where the surface shimmered like glass, stacking firewood damp from the storm. Clara tried her hand at splitting a log, her grip awkward, her arms trembling. When she laughed at her own failure, the sound startled Jed. It had been years since laughter had lived within these walls. At last, he stepped behind her, guiding her grip with hands rough and calloused. "Like this," he murmured. The log split clean. She glanced back at him, breathless from more than the labor. Later, as dusk settled again, Jed stood near the fire, his broad frame stiff with some inward battle. He said it without looking at her, his voice raw. "I can't control myself around you. Not the way you're thinking. Just, you make me want more than I should. More than a man like me deserves." Her heart thudded. She did not step back. She did not break the silence with easy comfort. Instead, she simply stayed, her nearness itself the answer. The peace was broken days later, when hoofbeats thundered on the trail. Voices rose outside, sharp, accusing. Sheriff Amos and a small knot of townsfolk stood before the cabin, Martha Calloway at the fore, her lips curled with righteous venom. "Clara Beaumont," Martha shouted, "you come out this instant." We know he's keeping you. Lord knows what he's done. Jed's jaw tightened. He reached for his coat, his movements heavy with resignation. It's easier if you say I forced you, he muttered. They'll believe it. Always have. But Clara was already at the door. She flung it open, standing tall though her hands trembled at her sides. The townsfolk gaped at her, hair loose, cheeks flushed from mountain air, her bearing unbroken. He saved me, she said, her voice clear though it cracked with emotion. The storm would have taken me, but he gave me fire and shelter. He gave me warmth when none of you would. Martha's face twisted. You'll ruin yourself, standing by him. You'll never be welcome again. Clara's chin lifted higher. Then I choose not to be welcome. Her eyes swept the crowd, settling finally on Sheriff Amos. I will not live a life built on fear of whispers. I'd rather live in truth, even if it means up here. For a long moment, only the wind answered. Then Amos, who had studied Jed with wary eyes, tipped his hat slowly. Then it's your life to live, he said, turning his horse. One by one, the others followed, their muttering fading into the trees. Only Martha lingered, bitterness hanging about her like smoke, before she too was swallowed by the trail. Clara's breath left her in a shudder. Jed, still by the hearth, looked at her, as though seeing a thing he had not dared dream of. Shame had bowed his shoulders for years, but now, for the first time, he stood straighter. They stepped outside together, the peaks aflame with sunset. Jed's voice, low and uncertain, broke the silence. You sure you know what you're choosing? Clara's hand brushed his, gentle but deliberate. Yes, for once. I am not choosing out of fear. They turned back to the cabin, the door opening to the glow of firelight. Behind them, the mountains stood eternal, keeping their secrets. And if you listen closely, even now, you might hear the old whisper carried on the wind, that the world will always judge, always whisper. But the heart, the heart must choose where it feels most alive. Sometimes dignity is not found in society's approval, but in the quiet company of someone who sees you as you are, scar and all.